Here to explore the possibility of former President Trump's second term, please welcome Atlantic staff writers Caitlin Dickerson, David Frum, and Tom Nichols. Here to lead the conversation is Adrienne LaFrance, the Atlantic's executive editor.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you especially to my colleagues for joining us. I have to note that in the recent days, talking to some of you, I've noticed a visceral reaction to the title of this panel, but we're going to have fun. I think, I promise. I think I'll start by asking a question that I probably should have asked you all before you were on this panel, but the assumption is Trump is running, right? Do any of you think that he's not?
I don't disagree with your assumption.
Barring a negative health event for him.
All right, I think he's running.
Okay, so I can keep asking all my questions. I figured we should start there. And we're not even through midterms yet. 2024 still, though, is sort of scarily close. And one thing I'm wondering, and maybe David, I'll start with you on this, is when you think about where we were as a country and the challenges we faced in 2016 when his first presidency began, and where we are now, how much has changed? And I ask in part to say, like, what would be the implications of the America he would inherit now versus then, knowing, of course, that so much of what has been challenging for us in recent years may have been as a result of his presidency, some might argue.
Yeah. Well, one thing that will be hanging over his head is this terrible armed crisis in Europe. Even if the active shooting has stopped, as we hope it will, there will be a gigantic problem of reconstruction that will require an enormous amount of resource and cooperation between the United States and all of its partners. So to have a president who does not believe in that will be very challenging. We're going to be facing the largest reconstruction project since the end of World War II.
And when you say does not believe in that?
Does not believe in that kind of cooperation, does not believe in helping others, does not believe that there's any upside to the United States, is hostile and mistrustful to the allies. Because I think there are two things that are going to, as you frame this, and not to give too long an answer, but please. He's not going to be the same person. He's going to be more bitter, more isolated, more focused on revenge. If in 2016 his message was, I alone can fix it, this time the message is, I alone. And the other thing is, to get from here to there is going to require a lot of collapse in the rest of the country. Because what it will have meant is that either all the wealth and power of the Republican Party now trying to make Ron DeSantis happen, that will either have stood down or been defeated.
And we'll go back to DeSantis in a bit, but staying on Russia just for a minute, Tom, I'm curious, you have such expertise in this realm. When you think about what kind of President Biden is in this moment, looking at the war in Ukraine, and the way he sort of positions himself against Russia, and then you imagine Trump in the Oval Office again, sort of lay out for us what that would be like.
Well, part of the problem is that we would finally convince our allies that we are an unreliable country. There's a great line in the original novel Goldfinger, where Goldfinger says, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, three times is enemy action. And I think, the first time as Trump was running, that our allies could say, well, this is a one-off, this is a strange event. And then when it's over, the adults will be back in charge, things will even out. That didn't happen. So now we're in that second moment of, he hasn't gone away. This sentiment is still out there. I think in some sense, Putin was counting on that when he invaded Ukraine. And if Trump is reelected, you will find that I think our allies will say, we had a great run with Biden, enlarging NATO. In some sense, Putin saved the American project and the NATO project. NATO should have a picture of Putin in the hallway saying, our benefactor. I'm
just imagining this being spliced somehow and used against you, but yes, I know what you're saying.
Well, the idea that NATO would be 32 nations, including Finland and Sweden.
Wait, it happened so quickly, too.
Yeah, when I first started studying Russia, we just assumed that would be a cause for World War III. And now it's going to happen. But if Trump is reelected, I think that the Russians will say, good, we were right all along. And the Europeans will say, we're going to have to start thinking about making other arrangements. That we've proven to the Europeans this can happen. If we prove to them that it can happen again, then I think we're going to have a really serious problem.
We'll go back to domestic issues for a moment. And I wanted to ask you, Caitlin, your recent brilliant cover story, which I really implore all of you to read. It's one of the most remarkable things the Atlantic has published. A really amazing story about family separation and its origins. In that piece, you make the case that if Trump were to be reelected, that family separation would come back as policy. And you make this case very persuasively. Given the extent to which the Republican Party has now coalesced around Trumpism, is that true for any Republican president, do you think? Or is it really unique to Trump?
I don't think that it's unique to Trump. I wouldn't say any Republican president would pursue family separations, but I could certainly see a Ron DeSantis pursuing family separations. And that's in part because one of the biggest takeaways from reporting that story was that, this wasn't an idea of Trump's and Stephen Miller's, his chief immigration advisors, and no one else. I mean, it took so many people to make this idea happen. It wasn't even an idea that first came about in the Trump administration. It's really an idea that came up through the immigration enforcement apparatus from people who'd been working in enforcement for decades, waiting for Congress to intervene. I don't want to get too off topic because I know we're focused on Trump here, but the point is there are still a lot of people who work in immigration who believe really strongly in this. And so I think what Trump, what DeSantis, and what a number of other Republican hopefuls might think is, immigration is and their stance on this tough stance on immigration, this aggressive and even deliberately harmful stance on immigration is rousing to a particular set of voters, clearly one that Ron DeSantis is trying to speak to now. And so, I think the threat of family separations and similar policies coming back is definitely not limited to Trump.
There was a theory that I often heard and myself debated with other journalists during Trump's presidency, which was this question of whether incompetence could be a form of protection. Like maybe if you're really bad at being president, you might not mess up things too terribly. Caitlin, I'll stay with you on that. Given now what we've seen with his potentially first term, if he goes on to have a second one, do you think that incompetence is better than maliciousness, I guess, or I don't know if there's a line to be drawn there.
It's hard to say which is worse. I did try to speak to that point specifically in the story, and I'll give credit to my editor, Scott Stossel, because that was his thought initially, was that, so often you hear that, how did I put it, that the incompetence, mitigated malevolence in the Trump administration, but actually when it came to family separation, it exacerbated the issue because incompetence allowed for, a very small number of people who felt really strongly to pull the wool over a lot of eyes and push forward an idea that, there was so much evidence before, during, and after was going to be disastrous, partisanship aside, and even really the morality of the question of whether to separate families or not aside, the logistics of it. So, I think both can be very destructive is the conclusion I came away with.
Let's talk for a minute. Ron DeSantis has come up a couple times. David, do you see any Republican who could beat Trump in a primary, and if so, who?
Don't take it from me, but everyone in the Republican Party who can write a $100,000 check, everyone at the Republican Party who programs Fox News, they all think Ron DeSantis can do it and should do it. So that's their bet. Do you
think it's a smart bet?
Well, it's a smart bet in the sense of what choice, the alternative is Trump. So they're making the best bet they can. There's a wonderful line in the movie Argo, the movie about rescuing the American hostages in Iran, where the CIA agent who has designed the plan brings it to the director, and the director says, "This is not a very good plan." And the agent says, "No, sir, it's not," and then says, "But it's the best bad plan we have." And I think that's sort of where they are. As you just said just now, I mean that DeSantis is trying to emulate some of the affect of Trump while reducing some of the content. But here's the thing: we need to think not just about this as an open question, because there are external shaping events that are going to decide whether this is possible and where we are if it happens. And one thing to pick up on the important points you're making about the immigration system is barring a really severe recession in the next little while, the great shaping fact of the 2020s across the developed world is going to be demographic crisis. 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 every day. I think a lot of people have the habit of thinking the baby boom is something that happened in the 1940s. But in terms of when were the absolute largest numbers of babies born, they're born between 1957 and 61. 57 turned 65 this year, and so on. And so across the developed world, you have this exodus of baby boomers out of the labor market, and that we're seeing for a lot of reasons that are much debated, and it doesn't matter what the reasons are, that the next generations are not as committed to the labor force as the baby boomers were. And so the things everyone sees, the chronic labor shortage problems, are going to send this message to the rest of the world. The US, the EU, the UK, they are hiring, they can't generate enough people, they are hiring, and people will take tremendous risks. And that is going to make immigration, both legal immigration, illegal immigration, asylum seeking, which is a different thing again, that's going to be a real flashpoint. It's going to be a flashpoint inside the Republican Party, because people who run businesses that need labor are going to have one point of view, and the Republican TV-watching retiree audience is going to have a different point of view.
Right. Tom, I'm curious for your views on who in a primary election could beat Trump. Obviously, President Biden is the one person in a presidential election so far who's done it. Does it have to be him again? There's all sorts of other political complexity wrapped up in that, but can you imagine another Democrat coming forth and winning?
Against Trump? Probably not. Biden, I think, hit a kind of sweet spot demographically, temperament, in terms of temperament, in terms of just kind of the working class backstory, and so I'm hard pressed to imagine who comes out of a Democratic primary. And that itself, I think, is an issue, because there may be stronger Democratic candidates out there, but the problem is that any kind of, assuming President Biden, wish him all the health in the world, or that if he just steps down or whatever it is, the primary process itself, I think, is just so destructive that whoever comes out of it will be beatable by Trump, unless Trump, Trump is his own worst enemy in that sense. But I just worry about a dust-up between Vice President Harris and 2 or 3 other people. So I think Biden is still the strongest bet.
I'll stay with you for a sec, Tom. This may be semi-provocative, but the United States survived one Trump presidency. Why wouldn't we survive another? What has changed? Did we just barely survive it? Like, sort of walk us through, to what extent is worrying about a Trump presidency a second one that is overblown, if at all?
Well, you know that I try to stay away from provocative.
Ha ha ha. Everyone subscribe to his newsletter. It's great.
But the question is, did we survive it? A lot of the guardrails have been broken, and not just our legal and institutional guardrails, but cultural guardrails. There are things now that happen in our public life that would have been absolutely unthinkable, career-ending, national scandals. And the fact is, after 5 years, we've just gotten used to it.
Even like the coarsening of public discourse, I've been thinking about that.
That President, that Trump as a candidate and then President Trump in office said and did things that coarsened our life, and there's a kind of ratchet effect to that. That you can't just walk that back and say, now we're going to start referring to our political opponents as human beings and decent people, and the kind of John McCain, a man with whom I have disagreements, and so on. What I really worry about with, and I wrote about this for us at one point where I said, you won't get a collapse of American democracy. What you will get is an America that is a patchwork of authoritarian states and less authoritarian and very liberal or free states, especially if you're a woman, person of color. That the difference between driving from Boston and New York or driving from Charleston to Miami will be a very different experience, and I think that's the part where if we're talking about not surviving it, we don't survive it intact as an evenly distributed democracy where all the laws of the country apply all the time.
Caitlin, as someone who has spent a long time focused deeply on his administration and how it works or didn't work, what's the thing that you think people most misunderstand about Trump, either as a man or as the president?
I wish I came away with more surprising conclusions about Trump. I mean, I think what the story showed me was that he was an empty vessel. And I think, we knew that though, right? We knew that about Trump as a candidate, that he really didn't care all that deeply about immigration until he started to talk about it and then feel really good when people were clapping and cheering. And so he just continued and wanted more and more and more, in a way that was completely divorced from reality in so many ways, proposing things like alligators and moats and shooting people. I mean, it's not, anything that I can say you've heard before, it doesn't make any sense. It's not normal. It's not evidence-based. It's not even, in the realm of reality. And so that is the most dangerous thing about Trump. People have said it before.
And trying to understand him is futile almost.
It's a really pointless exercise. And
hard for journalists to get that.
Maybe
we
though,
really try.
And let me correct myself a little bit in that, I was by and large not surprised by what I learned about Trump. But the thing, and again, not to get too specific here, but that did surprise me was Stephen Miller. What was it about Stephen Miller that gave him such lasting staying power? I talked to cabinet secretary after cabinet secretary who would tell me about, being bullied around by somebody who was so far below them in the chain of command. And I would say, well, why did you not say anything? And, it's no surprise why Trump's children have so much influence and continue to stay close to him. But Stephen Miller and his relationship with the president was really, really unique. And so again, I know I'm focused specifically on immigration, but you can expect that, what Stephen Miller wants, Stephen Miller will get if Trump comes back because of that bond that I still don't quite, fully understand. I mean, what I was told is that the sort of feeling in the White House was that it was Miller's speech writing that won Trump the presidency. And so, Trump was scared to ever let that go.
The America First, the inaugural speech, all that. David, Tom talked a little bit about this idea of a patchwork of states, some of which are more authoritarian. For you, what is the most concerning when you imagine the prospect of a second Trump term? And earlier you talked about this sort of I alone mentality, but what, strikes the most fear to your heart when you think of this?
I want to say just about understanding Trump, and maybe I'm going to be too glib after. The way I always understand him is to say, before he's a thug, he's a crook, and before he's a crook, he's a head case. And just imagine those as like a decision rule. So he's involved, yes, he wants to be a dictator, but he wants to steal more than he wants to be a dictator. But even more than he wants to steal, he's psychically needy. I mean, one of the things I took from the story about these allegedly falsified financial statements is that he also, at the same time, told his financial advisors he wanted to see his net worth rise every year. And you think, well, that's not a good, that's actually, if you're planning a crooked scheme, you want to make the numbers go up in a wiggly pattern. That looks more innocent than if they go in the same pattern. I mean, no one's numbers go up every year. So but he needed that, and he compromised his crookedness by his headcaseness. When I think about the second term and what I worry about, I think there are things that are happening. As I say, I'm worried about the things that are driving us to the possibility of a second term. And let me tell you about something that I really worry about a lot. And it's not just personal to Donald Trump. It's something that's going to be, it could be very imminently a problem. So beginning in the Tea Party years, there were government shutdowns all the time. And there was grandstanding about the debt ceiling all the time. Senator Barack Obama voted against raising the debt ceiling in a kind of showy and pointless and destructive way. But when you had these grandstanding events, everyone always understood there had been a vote count. And there was no actual possibility that this thing was going to be real because it was a performance. And Obama took the stance he did because he was actually up for something and he was trying to make a point. Beginning in 2011, what had been a game played with paper mache weapons became a game played with real weapons. And although the senators and members of the House were as determined as before not actually to drive the United States into a world-shattering financial crisis, they were playing the game much more roughly. And I worry that a lot of those inhibitions against the way the game has been played are going to tumble someday into a miscalculation. And you've been seeing that there have been, back at the immigration front, that there have been members of the House Freedom Caucus who have been saying they want to try to spark a shutdown crisis if the Republicans get a majority in the House. They want to spark one of these things. And that habit is just back. And one day someone's not going to quite calculate it right. And I don't think people understand just how the United States government, the largest economic actor on the planet, if it decides to stop meeting its obligations, it's just what a shattering wreck that. And that's not Trump, but that's the system contemptuous attitudes that make a Trump possible.
This is a perfect segue to what I'm afraid has to be our last question, and I'll go to you, Tom, which is one of the big lessons, I think, for our country after 2020 was that even Trump's defeat did not defeat Trumpism. It's, if anything, more influential in many ways. And so I guess my question is, if he were to lose again, would that do the trick, or are we dealing with something much deeper and more ingrained?
Well, there's a couple of things. First, he's preparing the country for violence. I just don't think there's any, especially these last few rallies. I mean, he's basically saying, give me what I want, stop investigating me, get out of my way, or I will instigate violence. The other problem, when he ran the first time, I was talking to somebody who knew Mattis, James Mattis, and I said, you guys served together. Is he going to be the kind of person who's going to say no? Will he be a safety? And he said, yeah, I don't know, I think so. We're not going to have those conversations anymore, because what's happened and what's clear even now that Trump is gone is that as any kind of functional institution, the Republican Party has completely collapsed.
Right, so this notion of the grown-ups in the room is
well, and more than that, think about, and one thing we haven't talked about, and just to be as dystopian and depressing as possible at the end of an afternoon, sorry, but think about the kind of staff and appointees that are going to follow into a second Trump administration. If the Senate is in Republican hands, there will no longer be even the pretense of trying to bring in people who have any interest in or professionalism. I mean, it'll be the political equivalent of the Star Wars bar at that point. Where it's just going to be kind of as outrageous as possible, because he will bring in all the people that he was told the first time you can't bring that person into government. And if the Republicans come with him in 2024 and he has a Senate that will approve those appointments, then we really are facing a kind of collapse of institutions in the sense that they genuinely won't, kind of the thing David's talking about with debt ceilings and budgets, that these institutions just start to cease to function after a while.
Well, I hate to leave it on such a dark note, but this has been a fascinating conversation, my brilliant colleagues, and thank you so much to all of you. Thank you.